Welcome to Discover the Difference, a podcast brought to you by C3. I'm your host, Jamie Reed. Today, Gabe and I have on Mark Davidson, who you may recognize since he came on previously and spoke about geopolitical relations. Mark gives us an update on the conflict between Iran and the US, as well as updates on what's happening between Ukraine and Russia. Then we talked about his more recent work in executive protection. After leaving the CIA, he went on to become a part of the executive protection crew for Starbucks, helping make sure the logistics of all their executives is coordinated for everywhere they go in the world, and how he does that work now with Concentric for people who are moving into places that may or may not have known conflict. It's a super interesting conversation that casts some perspective on things that you might want to consider as you take your own travels around the world. Enjoy this episode with Mark Davidson. Well, Mark, why don't you, we obviously know you traveled the world with you, but maybe give us a little bit of a background leading up to joining the CIA and why you decided to do that, and we'll kind of take it from there.
Yeah, sure. No, happy again. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here again. I think as we mentioned before, right? I'm a Midwestern kid originally. Grew up outside Chicago, what's now a bedroom community, but back then it was still kind of rural and a farming community. What's kind of interesting about that in my case is I didn't even meet someone who worked for the government. I didn't know anybody who'd ever been a part of the government. You know, it's a mostly working class, middle class sort of communities. But I was a product of the Cold War, and I had one unusual advantage. My mom was Canadian, and she and my dad had met when he was in the service in Scotland. So I had this, echoing conversation around my house. The world was a little bit bigger, and I was a reader. And so really starting in like middle school and stuff like that, I started reading all that Cold War fiction, George Smiley, Spy versus Spy, smoking cigarettes on the foggy bridge. And I was a little bit of a romantic as a kid, and that kind of stuck with me. And so as I, go through college and I go off to grad school, I was doing a PhD in American literature, but I always really liked that stuff. And I had traveled a lot because I played hockey, and I played at a level that allowed me to go. I played at Russia in 83 and 84. So I kind of had a sense the world was big. And I ultimately said, hey, somebody has to be a spy or an FBI agent or things like that. So I started my own little journey of like, do you know anybody? And do you know anybody? And then as I'm coming out of graduate school, somebody gives me a phone number, and I have this conversation with a gentleman who I don't know who this is. And to this day, I'm thankful to this person because, myself later on senior career, I know how hard it is to have people's time. This gentleman spent like an hour on the phone with me, and he says, listen, I think you would like what we do, and I think you might be a right fit, but you're a little bit underqualified. You don't really have like the chops. Go live a little, go live overseas, go do some things, and then, reach back out. So I did. I ended up getting a position at a university in Japan, and I traveled and I did some more things. And at a certain point, I just wrote another letter. I think I might have got the address out of the back of the New Yorker, or the Atlantic, one of those things where they would post it. And I got a letter back. I was overseas at the time that said, we received your letter. We'd like to speak, but don't call us till you come back to the States. So I kept that letter. About 6 months later, I came back. I called the phone number. And then for me, it happened very quickly. Like within 6 months, I was a clandestine service trainee, and that started a 20 plus year career with no regrets. And I loved every minute of it, even the bad days. So at that, again, small sort of doorways as things progress, but it really kind of started with like the romanticism of espionage and intelligence during the Cold War.
So did you have a Canadian passport too? Did that help you?
Interestingly, the CIA is not a fan of dual passported U.S. persons. So I didn't get it until I retired from the agency and then took advantage.
They're worried about dual loyalty.
I mean, I don't think they were like materially worried about myself and my Canadian mother, but rules are rules. And in general, if it's good for Canada, then it might be good for Cuba. And that they're a little bit more anxious about.
Right. They checked your accent and make sure that it...
No. I know what it's all about, eh?
What does a bad day look like in the CIA?
Yeah, it's I'm gonna guess
really bad.
90%. So there's two types of bad days. 90% of them are the same bad days that you have. It is, I'm so far behind in my accounting, I don't know where to start. And I'm still waiting for travel authorizations for the trip that everybody told me I have to take, but I can't get a seat because I can't get the authorization. Those are bad days. That's 90% of them. The 10% of the bad days where things go wrong operationally, when people are at harm and they're dangerous, and those are the most acute things. Those are the ones you spend your career trying to avoid, or you learn throughout your career how to master and mitigate when they do happen. But for the most part, when I'm thinking bad days, I'm thinking about all those things that I've now forgotten, right? That 10% bad days, I carry those with me. I certainly have thoughts on those, but most of the bad days, the grind of any bureaucracy and any sort of career, you forget about that shortly after.
It's the 10% of you, or like what they call them, like near misses, or things like where you almost had a bad day but you avoided it. Is there something that you could share on that, or high level?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, to be a bit somber about it, that's where people's lives are lost, or cases are disrupted in a way that has tremendous ramifications, both for the individuals involved and for U.S. national security and policy. Sometimes, like maybe on the lower side of that, are those things that you've invested tons of time and energy and soul and work into that just then don't materialize, and you realized I've spent years on this, or priorities changed, it goes away from that. So that's part of it, and that'll hang with you a little bit like old luggage. But then the other part of it is like, sometimes when you're out on the street, or I never felt this way as an operations officer when I was doing tradecraft around the street. As a manager, as a chief of station later on, you're sending young men and women out there with tools, technologies, or resources in a backpack in the middle of the night. And the plan is you're not going to hear from them for 48 hours until you learn what happened. And you spend the entire time like just wanting to everybody get home safe. So, I think we talked a little bit last time I was here about, then later on my role at Starbucks. And one of the first challenges I had in private sector was identifying what was a crisis, what was stressful. Because I came from a place where if there was no blood on the ground, really wasn't too worried about it. And that doesn't really work in the corporate sector because, that VP or regional director, this is the biggest thing that's ever happened to them. And they want you to react accordingly. And I'd be like, wait, I'm sorry, what? What's the issue? This is a big deal? That's exactly. And so somebody, one of my mentors in Starbucks was like, you might have to meet them a little bit more where they're at. That was really good feedback because I had come from a place that if everybody came home safe, I was good. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, sometimes hammer, sometimes nail. But if everybody's home safe, we'll work on it again tomorrow.
There's obviously a lot going on in the world geopolitically right now. I'm curious from a leadership perspective, and the way Trump seems to negotiate on the world stage, feels like it can sway from one end to the other overnight. Does that sort of thing have an impact on our CIA members that are in the field around the world? And how do you imagine they're managing that stuff?
Yeah. So it's a really good and timely question, and one that I think myself and some of my peers and colleagues are hearing more, because we spent the larger part of our careers under this one overriding mantra about service in the CIA is that CIA is apolitical and that the truth will set you free. So I believe that. I really, I've been inherited. That's wired through me. And part of that idea is that you're going to serve policymakers and national interests that you may or may not align with as a voter, but it doesn't matter because you have faith that there's a strategic plan and that people are doing it under their perspectives for the best interests of the broader community. That allows you, I think if you understand that, it doesn't matter who the president is, doesn't matter who the director of the CIA is, you have a mission to objectively identify, collect, and assess intelligence that informs U.S. policymaking decisions. That's what we do. Can be super sexy and a lot of fun, but ultimately it is a very academic, deliberative exercise. I do think, and again, I work really hard to sort of maintain, some neutrality on this because I think of what intelligence does as an apolitical event, but we do have this added factor where it is personal predilections and unpredictable behaviors that is informing stuff. It's almost like we have a new fact set, right? So it used to be you could count on the number of fact sets that would influence a decision on any factor of national security or foreign policy. Now there's really like moods and tempers that go into that. And it's very hard to find the rationale. The people who are conducting espionage and intelligence operations are some of the most smart, clever individuals that are creatively solving problems. And now we're asking them to do this in a context in which there is this consistent wild card that is very unpredictable, and you're uncertain how to bake that in. Going back to sometimes it's contrary to all the reasonable information and insights you have. One of the few sort of definitive things I tend to say in the shape of podcasts or conversations is that Russia represents an existential threat to the United States in a way that they fundamentally are defining themselves in opposition to the United States, right? You can be as trite as simply, if we say the sky's blue, the Russian side is going to say it's not, right? Regardless of what color the actual.
Sort of like a relationship with your kids.
It can be a little bit, particularly between the ages of 13 and 16.
Yeah.
They come back to you, Jamie, don't worry. So
Good to know.
They come back. So there is a little bit of that. And so, but you've had this, coming out of World War II, you've had decades of expertise and leaders that people have worked this stuff. We don't get paid for liking one side or the other. Like, you get to recognize who is a threat or who is a concern. And, coming out of my career, that is probably one of the most predominant ones that we face. But now we're trying to navigate policy in a number of areas as if that's not the case, that there's something there. And so it's very challenging to ask the same individuals that are responsible for, implementing policy or conducting intelligence operations to inform it, to sort of negate what we know to be true historically over time, not just a snapshot in window. So it can become really challenging. So, yeah.
It's hard to separate, too, between, the mission and the politics, it seems like, in this day and age. I mean, we saw there's a lot of reported on, Venezuela and, what happened there with taking out Maduro.
It seems like years ago.
It seems like years ago. We're talking like just months.
Yeah.
And the CIA was very involved in, the intelligence and the thought process behind, who should be in power after.
I think half of what your question's maybe not as hard as you think. Like, because I do believe, the men and women of the U.S. services, the Central Intelligence Agency, FBI, what have it, they signed up to execute. And what I would say in the agency is share your piece and then salute smartly and go do what you're told, right? Like, be honest, be straightforward. If you don't think it's a good idea, it's up to you to articulate that, make your case. And then when they say, yeah, thanks for all that, please go do it anyways, then you go do it to the absolute best of your ability. And I do think that is still largely. So when you think about the situation of, the actions in Venezuela, all of a sudden, that sort of arose somewhat unexpectedly. I don't know, on the rack and stack of national security priorities, that Venezuela was really like in my top 7 at that time, but it leaped to the forefront, right? So in the end, I think it's easy for people to do that because they understand that's the package, right? That's what you signed up for. You're here to serve good, bad, and ugly. And otherwise, I do think longer ranging wise, when you're an advocate or a participant in the intelligence community or the national security ecosystem, it is very hard to know that you're always engaged in these things that sometimes seem counter to our short-term, midterm, and long-term U.S. national interests when you don't really understand the impetus behind it. And there is a fair argument to be made that maybe there isn't an impetus behind it. It's just random moments that we're all kind of wrestling, which is a really tough new data set that's influencing national security and foreign policy. So I think it is a challenge for people working in that space now.
That's interesting because there is, I don't mean to be too we're saying with an ex-CIA guy, it kind of goes hand in hand a little bit, but with some friends that were having a conversation this past weekend, and it was about, do you think that everything that the current administration's doing has a master plan behind it, from when they went to Venezuela, to Iran, with Russia, China, etc.? And people were split on, is there a plan there, or is it just whimsical, right? But if it were intentional and strategic, then I was curious, would a CIA individual in Venezuela, would they be given any sort of perspective on a bigger scale outside of Venezuela of what's going on, so that they do understand those things? Or is it just the commitment that you made and you're following the orders?
I think the short answer to that is no in general. I mean, I definitely have some of the coolest operations of my career. I still don't know what happened in the end, right? I had my role, I was in, I was out. For all those reasons that make intelligence valuable, compartmentation, protecting our sources, you don't always get to know the end of the story. Sometimes you're the catalyst of the story operationally, and then you turn it over and you go off on your career and you have no reason to know. Need to know is a driving factor of operational execution, right? People need to know their role. They need to be prepared. They need to execute very well. And then if you need to know something else, we'll let you know what it is. And so that happens. So the short answer is no, they don't have a ton. At the more senior levels, right? The leaders in CIA headquarters, in the DNI, the intelligence community, they might have a greater sense of the atmospherics should there actually be a programmatic plan to it, but that's not necessarily going to trickle downhill. So that is part of the package, right? Sometimes you're going to be like, why am I doing this? And, that great line from Saving Private Ryan, right? You just, you could get to complain about that in a certain director. I certainly know as a chief of station, I could not understand what we're doing, but you don't pass it on to your team. You say, here's what we've been asked to do. Here's how we go do it. And then, you go back and you call your counterpart as a chief of station in the next country next door going, what are we doing here? And that's just a normal way.
So it's not abnormal for the chief of station not to have the whole picture, even though they're still the chief of station.
So I will divide that between policy and operationally. It would be very unusual. There's always exceptions in the 100, but for a chief of station not to have familiarity with everything that's taking place in their area of operation. It is also equally common for them to not be part of the broader conversations that affect regional or national interest. There's always more. This is one of those interesting lessons that you get. One nice thing about being a leader in the agency is there are these built-in sound bites that you're going to get to share with younger officers that sound really smart. And one of them is there's always more to the story than you've been told. So be very thoughtful and reflective of that. I remember in one case early on, I was like, this doesn't make sense. We should do this. We should do that. And a manager just said, Mark, stop talking. You're an idiot. You have no idea what you're talking about. And I was a little bit taken aback. And then she paused and she simply said, by that, I mean, stop talking because you're an idiot, because there's more to this than is going to be shared with you. So and those who do know the larger story are just listening to you and you don't make any sense. And that was a great lesson to learn early on. And, I had many opportunities to remind almost everybody who works for you in the agency is smarter than you are. You generally have had the advantage of practice, expertise, street time. The people that they hire and bring in are every year smarter, more complex, more sophisticated, but they're also more naive. And so you get to pass on this wisdom along the way for sure.
Well, I want to kind of get your soundbite on geopolitics and talk about your work at Concentric as well. But before we do, I'm kind of curious because we're going to have Honor Foundation in here tomorrow. So we have a bunch of special force operators who are transitioning, and a lot of them are going to go through a difficult time in that transition. As you talked about CIA to Starbucks and the difference of blood versus what an executive felt was a crisis,
right?
It kind of struck me that, did you have any sort of letdown going from CIA level to work in executive protection at Starbucks, or how did you manage that transition?
Yeah, there's definitely a transition, right? I think the challenge, almost everybody who's coming out, is particularly the special operations group and those military cadres that you're describing, they have the capability to adapt. I think part of the challenge is sort of telling themselves that the cadence and the pace and the commitment to what you do will be different in the private sector. In part because whether it's in intelligence or whether it's in JSOC or it's in SOF or whatever, you are trained to do one thing better than anyone else can humanly do it, and all the resources and time and preparation goes into that. It doesn't really work like that in the private sector. You need to bring those skills and apply them in context in a timely manner. You're often not going to have the resources. Real quick aside, one of the challenges of executive protection in private sector, right? So for our corporate clients and for high net worth individuals or families, is they're investing in this. Security is important, but it's not unlimited resources as it might feel like if you're at the Pentagon or at the agency or something like that. So if an executive principal and an agency, a government agency, is going on a trip, there is an advance team. It is well staffed. They are there. They are rerunning every route. They do all these things. That's important. It's done really well. So we often hire in the private community people from this experience. They have this training, they know the playbooks, they're super good at it. And then they get to a company that is worth billions of dollars, but it's still managing a P&L. It's still organizing structure. And they're like, so there's going to be a trip to Paris. And then you people step like, great. How many of us are going in advance? Where they're staying? Like, what are you talking about in advance? You're going to call Jacques over in Paris. He's going to make sure the road's clear. And then you're going to go with him and then go do that. And it could be a bit of a challenge. Like, you have to take the skill sets you have and reapply them in a different resource structure. So the same thing sort of applies, as I've talked about, in sort of crisis leveling as well as resource management, is finding the skill sets to be a value add, make them better without necessarily having the expectation that it's going to be the way it was before.
Interesting.
So, leading into this idea of supporting, companies and then individuals, in this changing world, I'm thinking about February 28th, all of a sudden, there wasn't a lot of warning. There was warning, but, Rubio might have mentioned a few things like, hey, you guys might want to start looking for flights out of here on February 27th. And so there wasn't much warning for, Americans abroad, other people abroad, especially in the Middle East. How did you guys activate after that and start to support companies that were either your clients or just Americans or others to, help support them in the middle of a war?
Yeah, it was a really dynamic time, and there were a lot of requests for assistance, and a lot happened. And I think Concentric and other organizations did a really good job of supporting U.S. interests. I think part of the challenge is that almost always, if you have the right talent on site or you're connected with them in terms of partnerships, they're going to be able to problem solve for you in these kinetic fashions. The real trick is, and I think the more sophisticated organizations and the thoughtful one is, they've invested in this resiliency planning ahead of time, because you don't always know when that earthquake going to strike, right? You don't always know when there might be hostilities outbreaking. You might not know about a dynamic policy change that influences your operations, closes the Suez Canal so you can't get your oil through, right? And so there's all these things that are going on there. And I think where Concentric is effective and others in this space is working close with the partners to identify the risk landscape ahead of time. So even though there was very short notice in that particular case, for, I think, the informed watchers and the geopolitical, intelligence teams that are providing analysis, they're watching a lot of signs. Like, I have a whole list of benchmarks that I'm monitoring for any particular given location that tells me there might be a critical mass of problems coming together. That alone allows you to make decisions earlier, be more cost effective, and it saves the crisis, right? The goal of a crisis manager in many ways is to have a programmatic in place that you never get to crisis. So, moving people out. So if you see the signs, like evacuations comes up all the time, right? We did this in the government. We did this in the agency. I did it in the private sector, did it for Starbucks. When you see things coming, you want to move people out before transportation corridors shut down. When airspace is closed, FYI, airspace is closed. Private jets do not violate airspace closures, right? So when you get the signs that that's moving, it's time to get people out commercially. Then there's going to be a window where you can get you out privately or by charter. Then the airspace closed, and guess what? Now it's time for plan B, right? Where are you going to move people? Who do you move from your employee staff? Where do you move them? Who do you bring? There's a lot of policy. There's a lot of practice that goes into these things. And so, yeah, we were prepared, but it was a tremendously dynamic time. And then you're faced with the realities of modern commerce, right? There's only so many junkets that can get you out of Doha, into Berlin, and every major international company in the world is now trying to get those. The cost of local operations go up exponentially. The ability to get people seats to do this or that, it becomes pretty complex. So having indemnified programs or having a plan ahead that helps you identify them in advance could be really vital in this current.
Yeah, for people that don't know what Concentric does, can you just kind of, put that into context of maybe this most recent war where Concentric kind of activated, or maybe activated before?
For sure.
So and then maybe an example of, I don't know if you're able to say, what, who's an example of somebody that did a good job with the pre-planning to.
Yeah, I can certainly speak about that in generalities. We're always
It's like, when I was at Starbucks.
Yeah. This was obviously post that. So yeah, Concentric is a global security consulting company that has, I think it's probably key defining service lines are its executive protection programs that are both for individuals, high net worth individuals, family offices, but as well as corporate and C-suites. And additionally, it's sort of embedded services where if you need a global operations center, an intelligence team, we'll sort of staff that expertise and manage them and bring best practices to your organization so you don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. In addition to that, it does everything from private and maritime aviation consulting to intelligence programs to residential security assessments. So as you can imagine, post the late February events, there was a huge reaction. And reality is clients that were already engaged through a retainer partnership or had these evacuation emergency assistance programs had a real advantage because we had those things in place. We responded to a ton of new calls. People would hear about the name, they know me individually, or they would know another employee of the company, or they get the name and then they call, and we would always work to respond. So I think we're talking well over hundreds of people we evacuated out of it. I think the advantages, and it's sort of touched on this, is some of our retained partnership relationships, we sort of saw the warning signs. I'll give you one for free here to everybody out there. When the embassy in any country goes on authorized departure, what that means is, you know what, things are a little dicey here. So your family members, the kids in school, the spouses, when they're ready, if you feel all right, it's okay for them to go travel home. We will fund their tickets back to the States.
That's a warning sign.
Among the benchmarks, that's a good one to sort of keep your eye on.
It's a
because
flag.
it's an expensive thing for the U.S. government. So there's definitely some thought going into the fact that this might be getting increasingly unstable. That's the first start to start looking at commercial air options to get out. Things
That happens with the CIA as well too, right? Like if you were stationed at a place and
Yeah, that's under the ambassador. So, you talked about sort of, the ambassador ultimately leads U.S. interests in any sort of country. So that decision on authorized and then later on ordered departures where everybody's getting out, you don't have a choice in this. You don't have a choice in the matter. That comes out of the ambassador's office, and the CIA and others are, they observe that.
it seemed like that was like I remember reading like a news report where they felt like the State Department didn't do a good job with helping people get out quickly. What's your perspective on that? Because I think it's probably they have to balance that with surprise advantage.
It's a little bit trickier than you think, and you touched on the last bit there. I will only say, so through my career, for better or worse, I was in 4 different locations that went through some sort of authorized or ordered departure, evacuations, and family members. And I can't say enough good things about how much thought and work went into that. It is a big decision, right? You've got kids in school. You've got people with access to medicine and elder care. There's so much that goes into these things. So it's never taken lightly. But in the end, no blood on the floor, right? Everybody gets home safely. So they do tend to maybe lean on that. I have lived people saying they took too long to decide they decided way too early. I know I've been part of one authorized, actually ordered departure that I think if they just hung on another 48 hours, it worked out well. But that's in hindsight, right? And then it became a real challenge to get back. I will tell you again, another free one for people who have to think about these things is if you're going to turn it on, have a plan of when you turn it off. Because one of the questions is, so you authorize a departure based on fact set of its risk. You need to have some measurables when they go back, because things can stay in status in a long time, or risk levels change. Remember COVID, where we're 6 months in, we're all watching Netflix and wearing masks in our car, right? 2 months later, the infection rates are higher than ever, but everybody's like, I'm done with that, right? So you do get these sort of risk tolerances, and that goes into these departures and movements of people around the globe as well.
I just came back from Saigon and got a picture of the famous hotel where the helicopter had landed and evacuated the CIA out as the last people to leave. It's pretty interesting. But maybe as we wrap up here, I thought of you just yesterday morning. I opened my LinkedIn and saw one of our friends that was in Ukraine with us that lives in London had posted I think it was a State Department alert for travel for Americans. So we bring Concentric down to more of a personal level. Like I've used your services when we traveled to Mexico, and it was running a temperature recently after what we've been doing with the cartel down there. what's kind of what should just normal people be thinking with world travel, because it does feel like there's an anti-American sentiment out there right now. So how do you assess that?
Yeah. So two quick things, right? So the gravity I put to if you see an authorized departure, go out to really take that as a weight. I would put a much less gravity weight on the travel risk advisories. That's a little bit more complex because that's largely about the embassy supporting people who visit, right? Think of the number of people who visit France in the course of a summer. And if there's an evacuation or there's an issue, the bureaucratic burden, they tend to be a little bit more thoughtful on getting that out earlier to inform it and getting people to do a little bit of the extra due diligence to go. So it is a data point. Doesn't quite have the same weight for personal travel that authorized departures would. So setting that at one side. And then
So basically ignore those warnings.
ignore with the smallest of eye, or I think you absorb that, but I don't know. I would certainly not overreact to any one of those data points without something else going along with it. Separately to that traveling landscape, right? I tend to think it's a little bit better than the impression that we get here, because you're not getting all the stories of all the great, successful, happy travelers engaging with communities and cultures around the world every day. You're getting, bad news stories. It's just the nature of where we're at. So I tend to think it's a little bit better than what you're sort of reacting to yesterday morning. That being said, it is more complex and things are more volatile. It happens quicker. I think there are this area of I'm a ABP guy. Always be prepared, because it doesn't take time, doesn't take money. Be a little bit thoughtful, have a little bit of a backup plan, have some of these conversations. And I think I would encourage that in the many forms it takes, more than I would have 5 years ago. And I think that's it. I don't know, barring a couple specific reasons, that the world's any more dangerous than it was. Or for American travelers, I think you probably get more hostility in Vancouver and Toronto right now than you do in most places, right? Because that's just a, really antagonistic conversation for reasons that escape me completely. But for the most part, how did you find it in Vietnam? Were you welcome? Were people interested?
Super welcoming.
So I think that's the norm. I think that's the default standard. I would encourage people to go. Somebody asked me, should I go to Turkey? And I was like, oh, what do you mean? You asked me, Istanbul is one of the great cities to visit anywhere. It should be on everybody's top 10.
It's on our top.
So you're not recommending people to put the Canadian flag on their bag?
I've always found that a little bit. I am a proud, true, CIA retired officer supporting the United States who's also a Canadian citizen, and I wouldn't do that, right? If it's so risky, if it's so risky that you felt you needed to have a flag of another nation on it, I think the other question is, should I be here at all?
Right.
That's kind of that's sort of my school. So, so.
Well, we appreciate you coming on. I mean, we've personally got to experience hearing you speak several times now, traveling in Ukraine with you. I know Concentric scheduled our trip into Bosnia, and it's much more than people can imagine. I mean, all the logistics, the security updates, everything that happened was phenomenal. And then I think it did, when we took our family into Mexico, when the cartel issues were going on and they were putting the flags up, and you kind of said the same thing to me, it's not as bad as it seems. Be smart. But it felt good knowing that I had the app, that there's people locally if something went wrong. So for people who are listening and they may have some trepidation, what's the best way for them to engage with you, with Concentric, or to be able to learn more?
I appreciate that. Whatever's easiest for them. We certainly have a website, and you can sort of drop an email in there. You can reach out. I'm not hard to find on LinkedIn. And so whatever is most useful or easy for you. And then certainly myself or somebody else will touch base with you. And I agree. I like the way you phrase that, because ultimately peace of mind is a valuable resource, right? The ability to do what you want to do, live the life you want to live, and go the places you want to go with a bit of peace of mind and less worry about disruption you're never going to regret having that, as you take off on your travels.
Well, I think nothing says it more than when we have a government shutdown and people's flights stop flying, that the politicians figure it out, right? We all love our freedom of travel, so we don't want that to be under threat.
Yeah. So what's next for you?
Yeah, so it is, we're heading into summer. I've got a kid graduating from college, another one finishing their freshman year. Work is busy. There's a lot happening out there. So I'm fortunate enough to be doing some of these talks and podcasts along the way with the Alder Group and on behalf of Concentric and myself. So I'm really just sort of enjoying it, right? It is a difficult time out there. It's challenging for so many people in a lot of ways, and myself and my family, we all feel this. So I'm just going to try and do my best to stay upbeat, help people navigate through the tough times, and recognize, wherever your challenges are at right now, we'll get through this, and you do come out on the other side. And hang in there, and let me know if I can help it out.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate having you on.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.